broad chest of a man who had known work and war. She had to wrap his arm around her shoulders, half drag, half push him through the brush. The cabin was a quarter-mile off, but her legs never gave out. Inside, she laid him on her bed and stoked the fire higher. She boiled water, cleaned his wounds, and stitched up a gash on his side. It was deep. The bullet must have passed clean through, but he had bled long and hard. He did not speak for 2 days. On the third, his voice came rough, low. "Where am I?" "Safe," she said, sitting beside the bed with her hands folded in her lap. "About 5 miles from Crow Agency, a day's ride from Billings if you had a horse." He turned his head, eyes narrowing. "You're alone," Josie nodded. "I have been for a long while." His gaze softened. "You saved me." She did not say anything. She just looked at him. He tried to sit up, winced, and dropped back. "My name's Judson Jameson. Josie Langdon." He nodded once, as if that settled something. "You stitched me up." "I did." "You live here by yourself?" "I do." He looked around the small cabin, wooden walls, a patched window, a pot of stew simmering over the hearth, then his eyes settled back on her. "You shouldn't have done it, helping me. Could have brought trouble." "I have known trouble," she said simply. "I am not scared of it anymore." Judson watched her for a long moment, then his eyes closed again. By the end of the week, he could sit up and eat on his own. Josie brought him broth and bread, and later stew. She gave him her father's old coat to wear while his shirt dried by the fire. He never asked why she was alone. But he watched her watch the way she moved through the room, quiet and steady, like someone who had learned to live without being seen. On the 10th night, she caught him staring as she set down a bowl near his side. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated. "You do not flinch. Most women would." Josie lowered herself onto the stool beside the bed. "I flinched once, years ago. It cost me everything." He watched her, waiting. "I came west with my husband," she said, staring at the fire. "He had dreams of gold, of land, but he drank and things turned mean. He left me here 4 years ago, said he was going into town, never came back." Judson's voice was quiet. "You waited?" "I waited a year," she said. "Then I stopped." He looked at the scar that ran across her palm. She had not tried to hide it. "He stole the only horse, took all the money, left me with 2 mouths to feed." Judson's brow furrowed. "Children," she nodded. "Twins, Rachel and Reuben." "They were 3. Where are they now?" Her voice went flat. "Gone. I was sick one winter, could not keep them warm, could not keep them fed. A preacher's wife took them down to Wyoming Territory, said she could give them more than I could. I never saw them again." Judson leaned back against the headboard, jaw tight. "You were a mother." "I still am," she said, her voice breaking for the first time, "even if I have no one to call me that." Silence fell between them. The fire cracked. Outside, snow began to fall again. He touched her hand, just lightly, just once. But it was the first time anyone had reached for her in 4 years. "I am sorry," he said, "for all of it." Josie swallowed. "You do not need to be. You are the first person who has spoken to me like I still matter." "You do," Judson said. "You saved my life." By spring, he could stand. By summer, he stayed. He chopped wood, repaired the roof, hunted game. He never said what had happened to him, why he had been bleeding in the woods that day. But Josie knew a man who had seen war when she looked at him. She knew the way grief settled into the shoulders. One afternoon, as she was hanging laundry, she turned and found him watching her with something different in his eyes. "You could have left by now," she said. He stepped closer. "I do not want to." Josie's breath caught. Judson reached out and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. "You gave me more than a second chance. You gave me something I thought I had lost." "What is that?" He took her hand, pressed it to his chest. "Peace." She looked up at him, heart thudding. "I have not let anyone touch me in 4 years. I will not touch you unless you want me to." "I do," she said, voice shaking. He leaned in, slow and sure, and kissed her, and it felt like coming home. Judson started keeping a ledger. Not with ink, but with the rhythm of his hand's fence posts set straight again. A cellar dug deeper, a lean-to built for the mule Josie bartered for in town. It wasn't spoken, but each task marked a quiet promise. He was staying. One morning, the fog still clinging low to the meadow, Josie came outside to find Judson splitting cedar for fence rails. He paused when he saw her, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. "You ever think about taking that land north of the creek?" he asked. "Soil's richer there. Would carry wheat better than this patch." She folded her arms, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. "I never had reason to plant anything that took more than a season." Judson leaned on the axe handle. "You do now." Josie didn't answer right away. A robin flitted between branches above them, its song sharp in the morning hush. "I wouldn't know where to start." "I do," he said, setting the axe aside. "We could build it up. A proper field, maybe even a root cellar if we get stone hauled before frost sets in." "And then what?" He stepped closer, not touching, but near enough she could smell pine resin on his shirt. "We make it last." She felt her heartbeat shift, not fast, but deep, like something settling into place. "I never planned farther than next week," she said. "I'm asking you to plan with me." She looked down at her worn boots, toes dusted with dew. "I don't know how to be someone else." "I don't want someone else," he said. "I want you as you are and as you'll be." Her breath caught, not from surprise but from the weight of the words. No one had ever asked her to grow into the future before, only to survive the present. Later that day, they walked the north parcel together, boots sinking into loam softened by spring rains. Judson knelt to test the soil, his hands moving with quiet confidence, not asking for attention, only showing her what could be. "There's an ash tree up that slope," he said, pointing. "We could build a bench under it. Come evening, it'd catch the light just right." Josie pressed her hands to her hips. "You think about benches a lot." "I think about sitting beside you when the day's done." She laughed, surprised by how easily it came. "That's a new kind of foolishness." "It's the only kind I got left." She didn't answer, but she stayed beside him as he mapped rows with his boot heel, marking where barley might take root, where beans could climb. That night, she found him sitting on the front step, oiling the stock of an old rifle she hadn't seen before. He didn't look up as she lowered herself beside him. "You never told me where you came from before." He didn't speak at first, just kept working the cloth over the wood in slow, careful strokes. "I was born in Tennessee," he said finally. "Near the Cumberland, my father was a wheelwright. My brother fought in the war. I followed after him when I turned 18. You go east or west? East, Virginia first, then south. I saw too much. Did things I don't carry proud." Josie didn't press. She let the silence stretch between them, not heavy, just real. "When the fighting ended, I didn't go home. Couldn't bear the quiet of it. I drifted west through Missouri, then Wyoming. Found work where I could. Most places I never stayed long. But you stayed here." He met her eyes. "Because here I found something worth staying for." She looked away sharply, not because she didn't want to hear it, but because it cracked something open in her. "I've never been anyone's reason," she said. "You're mine," he said, without hesitation. In the weeks that followed, they planted together. Josie's hands learned the weight of seed, the arc of a hoe in rich earth. Judson taught her how to set irrigation trenches with stone, how to read the sky for weather shifts. One evening, after a long day of hauling water from the creek, Josie sat on the ash bench they'd built, her shoulders aching in a way that felt earned. Judson joined her, wiping his palms on his trousers. "Next spring, we could build a second room," he said, voice low. "I could see to it myself." "For what?" He looked at her then, steady. "For a family." Josie's breath caught, not in fear but in wonder. "I never thought I'd get that again." "You haven't lost it," he said. "You just needed someone to help you carry it forward." She leaned her head against his shoulder. The sun dipped low behind the ridge, washing the fields in gold. And for the first time in years, Josie felt the kind of stillness that didn't come from solitude but from belonging. By late July, the land behind the cabin had begun to hum with purpose. The barley field stood knee-high, beans climbing their rough frames, and the rows of carrots and cabbage held fast in the loam. Josie moved through it all with sleeves rolled and hair pinned back, sun catching on her cheekbones as she worked alongside Judson. He'd built a scarecrow from old flour sacks and a bent stovepipe hat, and though it leaned crooked, she caught herself smiling at it more than once. One evening, just before dusk, Judson returned from the creek with his trousers soaked to the knee and a string of fish slung over his shoulder. He set them down on the chopping block, water still dripping from his boots. "You ever got a trout on a flat stone?" he asked, brushing his hands on his thighs. Josie shook her head, brushing a curl from her temple. "I used to trade for salt cod when I could. Fresh fish is new to me." "There's a trick to it," he said, pulling out his knife. "But once you learn, it stays in your hands." She watched him work the blade in clean, practiced strokes. The sun had dipped low by then, painting the sky in copper and dried rose tones. She leaned her back against the porch post and crossed her arms. "Who taught you?" she asked. "My uncle," he said without looking up. "He ran a trapline in Arkansas, took me with him one winter when I was 12, said I needed to learn how to make use of what the land gives." Josie nodded slowly, gaze tracing the line of his jaw, the quiet way his fingers moved. When he finished, he carried the fish to the cast iron pan she'd set over the fire pit outside. As the trout began to sizzle, oil popping against the heat, he sat beside her on the steps. "I sent a letter," he said after a long pause. She turned her head. "To where?" "To a man I knew in Cheyenne. He's got a parcel he's not using. I asked if he'd sell me a team and wagon cheap. Something to get us through the next winter and maybe haul in some lumber before the snows." Josie's hands stilled in her lap. "You mean to build more than the second room?" "I do," he said. "You said once you stopped planning. I figure that means it's my turn to plan a little farther out." She stared at the edge of the field where the wind brushed through the grain in low ripples. "You think we'll need that much space?" "I think we should make room for what might come," he said. "Not just what's already here." A quiet settled over them, but it wasn't uncertain. It felt like the hush before a harvest when everything had been planted and all that remained was tending. She turned to him then, her voice low. "If we ever found them my children, if they were old enough to choose, would you?" Judson's eyes didn't waver. "I'd make a place for them, no matter what name they carried." Josie looked away, blinking hard, the firelight catching in the wet corners of her eyes. "I don't know if I'd even recognize them now." "You would," he said. "A mother always knows." That night, as the fish cooled and the stars came out in slow clusters, Josie stepped into the cabin and pulled an old cedar box from beneath the bed. She hadn't touched it in over a year. Inside were two small carvings, a bird with one wing missing and a horse with a chipped leg. Her children had shaped them with her husband's penknife on a summer morning long gone. She traced the curves with her fingertips, then pressed the box into Judson's hands. "These are the only pieces of them I have left," she said. "If I'm going to start again, you should know their names." He didn't speak, only set the box carefully on the table and lifted one of the figures, turning it gently in his palm. "Rachel and Reuben," she said. "They used to chase the chickens until they scattered into the brush. Laughed like the world didn't know sorrow." Judson looked at her then, and something deep passed between them, something older than grief and stronger than distance. He reached for her hand and held it in both of his, rough skin against calloused fingers. "Then we'll make this place one they'd be proud to come home to." Josie nodded, and the last of her fear cracked and fell away like old bark from a tree. She leaned into him, letting her head rest where his shoulder met his neck. Outside, the wind shifted northward. The leaves whispered across each other in long, steady sighs, and the moon, nearly full, rose over the ridge with a silver kind of promise. By early September, the air carried a chill that slipped between seams and under door frames. Josie began to lay by the store's smoked meat wrapped in cloth, onions braided and hung from the rafters, corn ground fine between stones. Judson cleared the last of the brush beyond the barley field, his hands blistered but sure, and started measuring for a second well closer to the cabin. One afternoon, while Josie mended a tear along the hem of her work dress, a rider crested the ridge east of the house. She saw the glint of tack first, then the slow gait of a chestnut mare. Judson stepped out from the woodshed, axe still in hand, and narrowed his eyes at the stranger's approach. The man dismounted before reaching the porch. His hat was worn, coat patched at the elbows, and he moved with the stiffness of someone who'd ridden too far without rest. "You Judson Jameson?" he asked, voice rasped by dust and distance. "I am," Judson said, stepping down to meet him. "What's your business?" The man pulled a folded paper from his breast pocket and held it out. "Name's Illy Hart. I was in Cheyenne when your letter came. Sam passed it to me, said you were looking for a team and wagon. I've got both if you can pay fair." Judson took the paper, eyes scanning it fast. Then he nodded once. "They sound sound. 2 geldings, steady pullers, wagons old but tight. I came through Miles City and down the Yellowstone. Took time, but I figured you'd want to see them first." Josie stepped down from the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "You came all that way for a maybe?" Illy looked her way. "He said he was building something out here, figured that was worth the ride." They walked to the rise where Illy had tied the animals. The horses were lean, their coats dulled by the trail, but they stood even and didn't flinch when Judson ran a hand along their backs. The wagon was rough-hewn, one wheel freshly replaced, but the bed was dry and the axles straight. "I can trade you summer grain, dried meat, and a rifle I brought from Arkansas," Judson said. "With coin to cover the rest come spring." Illy nodded. "That'll do." They shook on it, and Illy stayed the night, sleeping in the hay shed with his saddle under his head. In the morning, he rode out again, leaving behind the team, the wagon, and a quiet sense that things were beginning to lean forward. Judson spent the next week reinforcing the barn walls, fitting the wagon with new canvas, and checking the harnesses for wear. Josie gathered the last of the herbs from her drying shelf: wild chamomile, yarrow, and a clutch of dried mint, and packed them into jars for the cold months ahead. One evening, as the first frost dusted the edges of the grass, she found Judson sitting on the bench beneath the ash tree, a folded scrap of paper in his hands. She stepped beside him. "Something wrong," he unfolded it slowly, then passed it to her. It was a flyer, edges stained with rain and dirt, a preacher's notice from a township 2 counties south. At the bottom were names Reuben Langdon and Rachel Langdon listed among children placed with new families. Josie's lips parted, breath catching in her throat. "Where did you find this?" Illy gave it to me before he left. Said he saw it posted in a church hall near Sheridan. She traced the letters with shaking fingers. "It doesn't say where they went." "No," Judson said, "but it tells us they passed through, that they were safe." "That someone wrote their names down." Josie folded the paper and held it to her chest. "I didn't think I'd ever see proof again. Just knowing they were remembered," he reached for her hand, warm despite the cold. "We'll find them, Josie. Not today, maybe not this winter." "But we'll look," she nodded, tears slipping silent down her cheeks. "I don't need to take them from wherever they are. I only want them to know I didn't stop loving them." "They'll know," he said. "We'll find the right way." Later that night, as the fire burned low and the wind shifted through the eaves, Josie lay beside Judson in the bed they now shared. The silence between them was full of breath and warmth and the weight of something deeply rooted. "You gave me a life again," she said softly. "Not just a roof and ground to work. You gave me myself back." Judson turned to face her, brushing his thumb across her temple. "I didn't give you anything you didn't already have. I only stood beside you while you remembered." She pressed her forehead to his. "I want to marry you." His breath shuddered out, quiet and full. "That what you want, Josie Langdon?" "It's what I've wanted since the day you carried water to my bedside without asking anything in return." He kissed her then, slow and certain, as outside the first snow of the season began to fall, soft, steady, and full of promise. The first snow didn't last, but it left behind a hush that settled over the land like a held breath. The days shortened, and Josie began rising earlier to light the stove before the frost crept across the floorboards. Judson spent the mornings hauling timber from the ridge above the creek, returning with his coat stiff from cold and his boots thick with mud. He'd begun framing out the second room, measuring each board twice before setting it, moving with a patience that had become part of who he was in her life. They didn't speak of the wedding in grand terms. There were no invitations, no dresses, no preacher summoned from the town. One morning, Josie simply reached for the small tin box of her mother's things and pulled out the gold band that had once belonged to a woman who'd crossed the plains with little more than a skillet and a Bible. She set it on the kitchen table beside Judson's coffee. "That's the only vow I need," she said, his hand closed gently around it. "Then I'll wear it every day I draw breath." They exchanged vows beneath the ash tree before first light, breath visible in the cold, ground still hard beneath their boots. Judson spoke his promise without falter, voice low and steady. Josie answered with both hands wrapped around his, her words tighter but no less sure. There were no witnesses but the land, no music but the rustling of dry grass along the fence line. It was enough. That winter came in sharp, with ice crawling down the inside of the windows some mornings. A black bear was spotted early near the creek, and Judson set extra traps, though it never came near the house. Josie traded dried herbs with the Crow women she'd known since her first year on the land, bringing back beans, parched corn, and a single folded scrap of cloth embroidered with a pattern she didn't recognize. She stitched it into a quilt, one square at a time, while Judson carved a cradle from pine, even though she hadn't asked him to. He handed it to her one evening with sawdust still clinging to his sleeves. "It's not a promise," he said, "just a place to hold hope." She ran her hands over the smooth wood, throat tight. "Then we'll fill it when we're meant to." The nights grew longer, but the warmth between them never faltered. They read aloud Josie from the worn book of poems she'd kept wrapped in linen, Judson from his old journal, the pages stained and creased. They laughed more than either had in years, the sound rich and full in the small cabin. He taught her to play a game of stones he'd learned from a Choctaw scout during the war, and she showed him how to make ash cakes that didn't burn. In early March, a letter arrived from a schoolteacher in Sheridan. Josie opened it with shaking hands near the hearth, Judson standing behind her. It spoke of a family named Wainwright, ranchers who'd taken in 2 children nearly 4 years before. A girl who hummed while she worked and a boy with the same cowlick Josie had once smoothed down each morning. They were well fed, schooled, loved. "They want to meet you," Josie whispered, voice barely above the crackle of the fire. Judson took her shoulders gently. "Then we'll go." They left at first thaw, the new wagon loaded with gifts, a hand-carved box, a blanket stitched with their initials, and a jar of wild honey. The journey took 10 days, roads still soft with melt. When they arrived, the Wainwrights met them with wary eyes but kind ones. They led her to the back pasture, where 2 children raced in the wind, taller now, limbs stretched and sure. Rachel turned first. Her eyes widened, her hands stilling at her sides. "Ma," Josie didn't run. She walked, slow and certain, tears blurring the world. Reuben stood frozen, the same tilt to his head, the same solemn gaze. "I never stopped loving you," Josie said, kneeling in the grass. "Not one day." They didn't speak, only fell into her arms, arms that had waited 4 long years to hold them again. The Wainwrights offered tea, then a room for the night. Josie and Judson sat with the children until the moon rose, telling quiet stories, asking gentle questions. She didn't ask them to come back, she only listened. In the morning, Rachel placed a folded drawing in her hand, a picture of a cabin, a field, and 4 figures beneath an ash tree. "We could visit," Reuben said, voice soft. Josie looked to the Wainwrights, who nodded once. "Whenever you want," she told them. "We'll be ready." They returned to the homestead with a peace Josie had never known. The second room held a new bed now, just in case. The cradle sat near the hearth, a small quilt folded inside. Spring came in slow and bright, the barley greening, the creek running clear again. One evening, Judson sat beside her on the ash bench, a letter unopened in his lap. "Frumily," he said. "He's coming through again in summer. Says he might settle nearby." Josie leaned her head against his shoulder. There's room for more good men in this valley. He kissed her hair, his hand covering hers. You think they'll come back? He asked. They will, she said. When they're ready. The breeze moved through the barley, soft and steady, and the fading sun cast long shadows across the fields they'd made together. In time, Rachel and Reuben returned to visit each season, sometimes for a week, sometimes longer. They helped harvest, rode the mule up the ridge, and slept in the second room Josie had once thought she'd never need. They grew into fine, strong-hearted people, never forced, only welcomed. Josie planted a pear tree near the ash, and when it bloomed the following spring, she stood beneath it with Judson's arm around her waist, watching the petals fall like snow. They grew old together in that valley, never needing more than what they could hold in their hands and hearts.